The church door slammed behind Eleanor Hartwell with such force that the entire congregation heard it echo through the dusty streets of Salvation Creek, Arizona territory. And in that moment, standing alone on the wooden steps in her Sunday dress, she knew her life would never be the same. The year was 1878, and the desert sun beat down mercilessly on her shoulders as she tried to catch her breath. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the rage that coursed through her veins like wildfire. Reverend Michaels had just declared before the entire assembly that she was no longer welcome in the house of God. Her crime? Asking why women could not read scripture aloud during services, asking why the reverend kept half the congregation's tithes for his own comfort while families went hungry, asking why faith required silence instead of understanding. She had been asking questions for months. Each one met with increasingly harsh warnings. Today, the reverend had reached his limit. Eleanor refused to apologize for seeking truth, so he pointed his finger toward the door and pronounced his judgment. Banned. Cast out like a sinner, though her only transgression was thinking for herself. The town square was empty at this hour, everyone still inside listening to the sermon she would never hear completed. Eleanor walked down Main Street, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. She had nowhere to go. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving her the small house on the edge of town and enough money to survive if she was careful. Her mother had passed when Eleanor was just a child. She had no siblings, no close family. The church had been her community, and now even that was stripped away. She found herself walking toward the stables at the far end of town, drawn by some instinct she could not name. The smell of hay and horses was oddly comforting. As she rounded the corner of the building, she nearly collided with a man leading a dappled gray mare. "Whoa there," he said, steadying her with one hand while keeping hold of the reins with the other. "You all right, miss?" Eleanor looked up into the face of a man she had seen around town but never spoken to. He was tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a striking shade of green, like the rare patches of grass that grew near the creek after rain. He wore typical cowboy attire, a worn leather vest over a plain shirt, dusty trousers, and a hat pushed back on his head. "I am fine," she said automatically, though her voice cracked on the last word. The cowboy studied her face for a moment, and she realized tears were streaming down her cheeks. She had not even noticed she was crying. His expression softened. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you do not look fine." He glanced past her toward the church, where the congregation was beginning to spill out onto the street. "You are Eleanor Hartwell, are you not?" She nodded, surprised he knew her name. "I am James Coltrane," he said. "I work the cattle ranch north of town. I heard some of what happened in there." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I was sitting near the back. Left right after the reverend made his proclamation. Could not stomach sitting through the rest of his sermon after that." "You left?" Eleanor wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "You will get yourself in trouble." James shrugged. "I do not put much stock in men who use God as an excuse to keep people in line. Your questions were fair ones. Reverend Michaels did not like them because he had no good answers." Something in Eleanor's chest loosened at his words. Here was someone who understood. Someone who saw the injustice of what had happened. "Not many in this town would agree with you," she said quietly. "Maybe not out loud," James replied. "But I reckon there are more folks questioning things than you might think. They are just too scared to speak up like you did." Eleanor looked at him properly now, taking in the earnest expression on his face, the way he stood with an easy confidence that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin. There was something about him that made her feel less alone. "I do not know what to do now," she admitted. "The church was everything in this town. Without it, I will be treated like an outcast." James was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting up to the vast blue sky overhead. Then he looked back at her, and something shifted in his expression, a decision being made. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think if God is everywhere like they say he is, then he does not need 4 walls and a roof to hear us. If you want to worship, we can do it under open skies, Out there in the desert, under the stars, where everything is honest and real. No reverend telling us what we can and cannot say. No rules about who gets to speak and who has to stay silent. Eleanor stared at him, her heart suddenly beating faster. It was such a simple idea, yet it felt revolutionary. Worship without the church, faith without the institution, freedom. You would do that, she asked? Worship with me out in the desert? I would, James said, and there was no hesitation in his voice. In fact, I would be honored. I have been looking for a way to connect with something bigger than myself that does not involve sitting on a hard pew listening to a hypocrite drone on about damnation. This seems like a much better option. For the first time since she had been thrown out of the church, Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips. When? Tonight, James said. I know a spot about an hour's ride from here. Beautiful view of the sunset, and when the stars come out, you can see the whole Milky Way stretched across the sky like God painted it himself. Meet me at the north edge of town just before sunset. Can you ride? I can, Eleanor said. Her father had taught her when she was young, though she had not ridden much in recent years. Good. I will bring an extra horse for you. James tipped his hat to her. Until tonight, Miss Hartwell. Eleanor, she said, please just call me Eleanor. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and somehow more alive. Eleanor it is, you can call me James. She watched him lead his horse away, her mind spinning with the possibilities. This morning she had been a respectable member of the community, accepted even if not entirely understood. Now she was an outcast, banned from the church, likely to be shunned by half the town. Yet standing here with the promise of tonight's adventure ahead of her, she felt more hope than she had in months. Eleanor went home and changed out of her Sunday dress into something more practical for riding, a split skirt her father had made for her years ago and a simple blouse. She braided her long chestnut hair to keep it out of her face. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself watching the sun's progress across the sky with growing anticipation. When the light began to turn golden, she made her way to the north edge of town. James was already there, holding the reins of two horses, the gray mare from earlier, and a sturdy chestnut gelding that whickered softly as she approached. This is Copper, James said, gesturing to the gelding. He is gentle and sure-footed. He will take good care of you. Eleanor stroked the horse's nose, and he nuzzled her hand. James helped her mount, his hands steady and respectful, and then swung himself up onto his own horse with practiced ease. They rode out into the desert as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The landscape around them was harsh and beautiful, all red rocks and scrub brush, with mountains rising in the distance like the bones of the earth pushing through skin. The air was still warm but losing its brutal edge as evening approached. James led them along a narrow trail that wound between boulders and up a gradual incline. He was right about it being an hour's ride. By the time they reached their destination, the sun was touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple that seemed almost unreal in their intensity. They dismounted on a flat outcropping of rock that looked out over miles of desert. Eleanor caught her breath at the beauty of it. She had lived in Arizona territory for 5 years, but she had never seen it quite like this, wild and infinite and utterly indifferent to human drama. What do you think? James asked, coming to stand beside her. It is magnificent, Eleanor breathed. I feel so small out here, but in a good way, like all my problems are small too. That is exactly it, James said. Out here, you remember that the world is bigger than Salvation Creek and Reverend Michaels and all his small-minded rules. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, the colors deepening and shifting. When the last sliver disappeared below the horizon, James gestured to a smooth section of rock. "Shall we?" he said. They sat down side by side, and Eleanor realized she had no idea what to do. In church, everything was scripted, planned, someone else's words and someone else's order. Out here, there was no script. James seemed to sense her uncertainty. "I figure we just talk," he said. "Say what is in our hearts, ask our questions, Listen to the silence and see what answers come. So Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself speak the truth that had been building inside her for so long. She talked about her confusion over why faith required obedience instead of curiosity. She asked why God would create minds capable of questioning if he wanted people to blindly follow. She wondered aloud why the church seemed more interested in controlling people than helping them. When she finally fell silent, James began to speak. His voice was low and thoughtful as he talked about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about losing his mother to cholera when he was 16, about the way his father had used the Bible as a weapon to beat down anyone who disagreed with him. He had left home at 18, unable to bear the hypocrisy any longer, and had been drifting from place to place ever since, working cattle ranches and trying to figure out what he actually believed. "I think I believe in goodness," he said finally, "in treating people with decency and respect, in standing up for what is right even when it costs you something. If that is God, then I am faithful. If not, then maybe I do not need God the way the reverend defines him." Eleanor opened her eyes and found that full darkness had fallen while they talked. The stars were emerging, hundreds and then thousands of them, more than she could possibly count. The Milky Way stretched overhead exactly as James had promised, a river of light flowing across the black expanse. "I think you might be the most faithful person I have ever met," Eleanor said softly. James turned to look at her, and in the starlight his eyes were dark and serious. "I think the same about you. What you did today took more courage than most people will ever have." "It did not feel courageous," Eleanor admitted. "It felt terrifying. It still does. I do not know what happens now. Will anyone in town still speak to me? Will I be able to buy supplies at the general store? What if they drive me out entirely?" "They would not dare," James said, and there was steel in his voice. "You have not broken any laws. You have not hurt anyone. All you did was ask questions and refuse to apologize for thinking. If they try to run you out of town for that, they will have to go through me first." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. They had only just met, yet he was already willing to stand up for her. It was more than anyone else in Salvation Creek had done. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. James was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful, as though he was revealing something precious. "Because when I saw you standing outside that church this morning with tears on your face but your head held high, something in me recognized something in you. I have been alone for a long time, Eleanor. Not just physically alone, but alone in the way I see the world. I thought I was the only one who felt like the church was more prison than sanctuary. Then I heard you asking those questions, and I realized I was not alone after all." Eleanor's breath caught. She knew exactly what he meant, because she felt it too, that instant recognition, that sense of finding someone who spoke the same language she did. "I have felt alone my whole life," she whispered. "Even surrounded by people, I have always felt like I was different, wrong somehow." "You are not wrong," James said firmly. He shifted slightly closer to her. "You are brave and honest and more faithful than anyone in that church. Do not ever let them make you believe otherwise." They sat together under the stars, and Eleanor felt something shifting inside her, walls she had built to protect herself beginning to crumble. She barely knew this man, yet she felt safer with him than she had felt in years. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and James met at their desert spot 3 times a week, sometimes at sunset, sometimes in the full darkness of night. Once just before dawn to watch the sun rise. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their ideas about faith and meaning and purpose. James told her about the ranch where he worked, about the boss who was fair and decent, about the other cowboys who were rough around the edges but good-hearted. Eleanor told him about her father's death, about the loneliness that had consumed her, about how the church had been something to hold on to even when she disagreed with so much of what it taught. The people of Salvation Creek did not drive Eleanor out, but they made their disapproval clear. Women crossed the street to avoid her. Men tipped their hats but did not speak. The general store owner served her, but with a coldness that had not been there before. Only a few people treated her the same as always. The young school teacher, who had always been quietly rebellious herself. The doctor, who seemed to care more about healing than propriety. The owner of the boarding house, who had never liked Reverend Michaels. Eleanor found she did not care as much as she thought she would. Her life had become fuller, even as her social circle shrank. James was teaching her to really ride. Not just the careful trotting her father had taught her, but true riding, galloping across the open desert with the wind in her face and her heart pounding with exhilaration. She was teaching him to read better, for while he knew his letters, he had never had much formal schooling. They would sit under the stars with a book between them, and she would help him sound out words while he marveled at the stories contained in those pages. One evening in late summer, nearly 3 months after Eleanor had been banned from the church, they were sitting in their usual spot watching the sunset when James reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her beyond helping her mount her horse or steadying her on uneven ground. His hand was calloused and warm, and Eleanor's heart began to race. "Eleanor," he said, "I need to tell you something." She turned to face him, suddenly nervous. His expression was serious but not unhappy. "I have fallen in love with you," James said simply. "I did not plan it, and I know we have not known each other long, but it is the truth. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met. You are intelligent and brave and kind, and being with you feels like coming home after years of wandering. I do not expect you to feel the same way, but I could not keep it inside any longer." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "James," she said, her voice shaking, "I love you too. I think I have loved you since that first day when you told me we could worship under open skies. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me that I could be myself and still be worthy of respect and care. You have become my best friend and so much more." James raised his free hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, and she loved that he asked, that even in this moment he was thinking of her comfort and consent. "Yes," she whispered. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but she did not want to change her mind. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Eleanor had never been kissed before, but it felt right, like something she had been waiting for her whole life without knowing it. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. James rested his forehead against hers, and they sat like that as the stars emerged overhead, wrapped in each other's presence and the vastness of the desert night. Their courtship was unconventional by Salvation Creek standards, but Eleanor had stopped caring about what the town thought was proper. They continued to meet in the desert, but now their conversations were interspersed with kisses and the simple joy of being close to each other. James told her about his dreams of having his own ranch someday, a place where he could build something lasting. Eleanor talked about wanting to start a school for children whose families could not afford the fees the current school teacher charged, a place where questions were encouraged instead of punished. In October, James asked her to marry him. They were watching the stars as always, and he pulled a simple silver ring from his pocket. "It was my mother's," he said. "The only thing I have of hers. I know it is not fancy, but I wanted you to have something that meant something to me. Eleanor Hartwell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Eleanor looked at the ring, tarnished with age, but beautiful in its simplicity, and then at James's face, so full of hope and love. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." The ring fit perfectly, sliding onto her finger as though it had been made for her. They kissed under the stars, and Eleanor felt a happiness so complete it was almost frightening in its intensity. The question of how to get married presented a problem. Reverend Michaels would never perform the ceremony, and he was the only minister in Salvation Creek. The nearest town with another church was 2 days' ride away. "We could go there," James suggested. "Make a trip of it. Get married and spend a few days away from Salvation Creek." But Eleanor shook her head. "I do not want to get married in a church," she said. "Not after everything that has happened. Besides, we have been worshiping out here for months. This place is more sacred to me than any building." James's eyes lit up. "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I want to get married here," Eleanor said. "Under the open sky, with the desert as our witness. We can write our own vows, make our own promises. It will be real and true and ours." "What about making it legal?" James asked practically. "We would need someone to officiate and witnesses." Eleanor thought for a moment. "The circuit judge comes through every few months. He could do it. And we could ask the doctor and the school teacher to be our witnesses. They are the only people in town who have been kind to me anyway." And so it was arranged. The circuit judge, an older man named Bartholomew Carson, who had seen enough of life to be unshockable, agreed to perform the ceremony in the desert. The doctor, Samuel Hayes, and the school teacher, Mary Wilson, were both delighted to be included. Mary even offered to make Eleanor a dress for the occasion. The wedding took place on a cool November evening when the heat of summer had finally broken. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that Mary had sewn with care, with lace at the collar and sleeves. She had wildflowers in her hair that James had ridden 2 hours to find, bright splashes of color in the muted desert landscape. James wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair neatly combed, his eyes shining as he watched Eleanor approach on foot across the flat rock that had become their sanctuary. Judge Carson stood between them with his Bible, though he had agreed to let them write their own vows. The doctor and Mary stood to the side as witnesses. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. James went first, taking Eleanor's hands in his. "Eleanor," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I promise to always encourage your questions and never demand your silence. I promise to stand beside you when the world tries to make you feel small. I promise to love you not despite your strength and intelligence, but because of them. I promise to build a life with you where we can both be free to be exactly who we are. I promise to worship with you under these open skies for as long as we both shall live." Eleanor's vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them away so she could see his face clearly. "James," she said, "I promise to be your partner in all things, your equal and your support. I promise to challenge you to grow and to grow alongside you. I promise to love you with my whole heart, to respect your dreams and help you achieve them. I promise to create a home with you where honesty is valued more than propriety, and where love is more important than rules. I promise to walk beside you under these open skies for all the days of my life." Judge Carson smiled warmly. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride." And he did, thoroughly and joyfully, while the doctor and Mary applauded, and the sun sank below the horizon. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor felt as though she was glowing from the inside out. She was married, she was loved, she was free. They had a small celebration with the four of them. A picnic Mary had prepared with cold chicken and fresh bread and even a small cake. They ate and talked and laughed as the stars emerged, and Eleanor realized this was what community should feel like. People who accepted you as you were and celebrated your happiness without judgment or conditions. James had been saving his wages for years, and he had enough to make a down payment on a small plot of land about 5 miles from Salvation Creek. It was not much, just 40 acres with a creek running through it and enough grazing land for a modest herd of cattle. But it was theirs. They spent the first year of their marriage building a house, just 2 rooms to start with, but solid and well made. James had learned carpentry from his father, one of the few useful things that had come from that difficult relationship, and he taught Eleanor as they worked side by side. The house went up slowly, each board placed with care. They lived in a tent on the property while they built, and Eleanor found she loved it, waking up to the sound of birdsong and the sight of the sky through the tent opening, cooking over an open fire, washing in the cold creek water. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and every nail they hammered was a nail in the foundation of their life together. By the time their first anniversary arrived, the house was finished. It was small but beautiful, with windows that let in the morning light and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. They had furniture James had built and curtains Eleanor had sewn. They had a small herd of 20 cattle and 3 horses, including Copper and the gray mare, whom Eleanor had named Silver. They still went to their spot in the desert once a week to watch the stars and talk to God in their own way. Sometimes they prayed. Sometimes they just sat in silence. Sometimes they sang hymns they remembered from their childhoods, the words taking on new meaning out here where faith felt personal instead of prescribed. In the spring of their second year together, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, the way her body felt different, the morning sickness that had started recently. When she told James, his face went through a series of expressions, shock, then wonder, then pure joy. "A baby," he said, pulling her into his arms. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Eleanor said, laughing as he spun her around gently. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," James said. He set her down and knelt in front of her, placing his hands on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. Your mother and I cannot wait to meet you." The pregnancy was difficult at times. The summer heat was brutal, and Eleanor felt huge and uncomfortable. But James was attentive and caring, bringing her cold water from the creek, rubbing her aching back, reading to her in the evenings when she was too tired to do anything but lie on the bed and try to stay cool. The doctor came out to check on her regularly, refusing to take payment because he said he was honored to be part of their lives. Mary visited often as well, bringing gifts she had made for the baby and keeping Eleanor company when James had to be out working the cattle. In October, as the weather finally began to cool, Eleanor went into labor. It was long and painful and terrifying. Mary stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths while the doctor worked and James paced outside, too nervous to be in the room but too worried to go far. Finally, after nearly 20 hours, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The doctor placed him in her arms, and she looked down at his tiny red face and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. James came in as soon as the doctor called him, his face pale and anxious. "Eleanor, are you all right?" "I am fine," she said, exhausted but radiant. "Come meet your son." James approached slowly, almost reverently. When he looked down at the baby, tears began to stream down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months but never decided. Now, looking at her son, Eleanor knew. "Thomas," she said, "after my father, Thomas James Coltrane." "Thomas," James repeated, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers wrapped around his father's finger, and James let out a shaky laugh. "Hello, Thomas. I am your papa, and I promise to teach you everything I know. I promise to answer all your questions and encourage you to think for yourself. I promise to love you and your mother with everything I have." The doctor and Mary left them alone, and the three of them sat together in the fading light, a family. Eleanor felt a completeness she had never experienced before. This was what she had been searching for, not answers to her theological questions, but this connection, love, purpose, a life built on truth and mutual respect. As Thomas grew, the ranch grew with him. James's reputation as an honest man and a skilled rancher spread, and they were able to buy more cattle and more land. Eleanor started her school, just a few children at first, meeting in their house twice a week. She taught reading and arithmetic and encouraged questions, lots of questions. Word spread about the school teacher who welcomed curiosity, and more families began to send their children, even some from Salvation Creek. Reverend Michaels made his disapproval known, preaching sermons about the dangers of secular education and women who overstepped their proper roles. But fewer people listened to him now. Eleanor's questions had planted seeds of doubt in more minds than the Reverend realized, and her example of building a good life outside the church's approval had shown people there were other ways to live. When Thomas was 3, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. She was a calm baby, easier than Thomas had been, with her father's green eyes and her mother's chestnut hair. Thomas was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything, bringing her toys and singing to her in his high, off-key voice. Life settled into a rhythm. The ranch prospered. The school grew. Their family was healthy and happy. Eleanor and James still made time to go to their spot in the desert, sometimes bringing the children to sleep under the stars in a nest of blankets while they watched the sky and talked about their dreams for the future. On their 5th anniversary, as they sat in their usual place with the children asleep nearby, James took Eleanor's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, "just being banned from the church, becoming an outcast?" Eleanor thought about it seriously, looking back at the woman she had been, standing on those church steps with tears on her face and no idea what would come next. "No," she said finally, "not even for a moment. That day was the worst and best day of my life. The worst because I felt so alone and rejected. The best because it led me to you. Everything good in my life came from that moment when I refused to stop asking questions. Everything good in my life came from meeting you," James said. He kissed her softly, and she leaned into him, feeling grateful beyond words for this man who had offered her open skies when the world tried to box her in. When Thomas was 7 and Grace was 4, Eleanor gave birth to twin boys, Samuel and Daniel. The house had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family, and they added 3 more rooms and a second floor. The school had outgrown their home, so James and some of the other fathers in the area built a proper schoolhouse on their property, a sturdy building with big windows and rows of desks. Eleanor taught every day now, educating nearly 30 children whose parents valued learning and independent thought. She taught them reading and writing, mathematics and history, but more than that, she taught them to think critically, to ask questions, to seek truth, rather than accepting what they were told without examination. Some of the children came from families who still attended Reverend Michael's church, but they sent their children to Eleanor anyway because they recognized the quality of education she provided. The Reverend finally left Salvation Creek when Thomas was 10. The congregation had dwindled to less than half its original size, with many families choosing to worship in their own ways or traveling to other towns where the preaching was less harsh. A new minister came, a younger man named Pastor Williams, who had been educated at a seminary in the East. He preached a gentler kind of faith, one that emphasized love over judgment and encouraged questions as a path to deeper understanding. Pastor Williams came to visit Eleanor and James one spring afternoon, arriving on horseback with his hat in his hands. Eleanor invited him in for coffee, curious about what he wanted. "Mrs. Coltrane," he said, "I wanted to apologize to you on behalf of the church. What Reverend Michaels did to you was wrong. Your questions were valid, and you should never have been punished for seeking truth. I know I cannot undo the past, but I wanted you to know that you would be welcome in our congregation now if you ever wanted to return." Eleanor was moved by his words, but she shook her head gently. "Thank you, Pastor Williams. I appreciate the apology more than you know, but I have found my own way to worship, and it suits me better than any church ever could. I hope you will build something good in Salvation Creek, a place where people can question and grow in their faith, but it is not my place anymore." Pastor Williams nodded, seeming unsurprised. "I understand. But I hope you know that what you have built here, this school, this example of a life lived with integrity and courage, has changed this community. You showed people that faith and independent thought are not enemies. That is a powerful legacy." After he left, James came to stand beside Eleanor on the porch, watching the pastor ride away. "He seems like a good man," James said. "He does," Eleanor agreed. "I hope he succeeds. But I do not need the church anymore. I have everything I need right here." She gestured to the ranch spread out before them, the schoolhouse where children's voices drifted through the windows, the house full of their own children's laughter, and the desert stretching to the mountains in the distance. Most of all, she had James, standing beside her as he had for over a decade now, her partner and equal, her best friend, and the love of her life. The years continued to pass, bringing the expected joys and sorrows. James's father died, and though James had not spoken to him in years, he grieved for what might have been. They attended the funeral in Texas, and James made peace with the past, accepting that he could not change his father, but he could choose to be different. Eleanor saw him with their children, patient and loving and always willing to answer their endless questions, and she knew he had broken the cycle. Thomas grew into a thoughtful young man who wanted to be a teacher like his mother. Grace developed a gift for healing and began apprenticing with Dr. Hayes, who was getting older and needed help. The twins were wild and adventurous, always getting into trouble, but good-hearted and loyal. When Eleanor was 42 and James was 45, their children were grown or nearly grown, and they found themselves alone in the house more often than not. One evening they rode out to their spot in the desert, something they had not done, just the two of them, in months. The desert looked exactly as it had the first time James brought her here, unchanging and eternal. They sat on the same flat rock where James had first told her they could worship under open skies, where he had first kissed her, where they had made so many promises and plans. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Eleanor asked, leaning against James's shoulder. "I remember everything about that day," James said. "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, even with tears on your face. I remember feeling like I had been waiting my whole life to meet you. I remember going home that night and knowing my life had just changed forever." "Mine too," Eleanor said softly. "I was so lost that day. I thought being banned from the church was the end of my life. Instead, it was the beginning. You showed me that I did not need anyone's permission to have faith, to ask questions, to be myself. You gave me freedom, James. You gave me everything." "You gave me a home," James said. "Not just this house or this ranch, but a place to belong, a reason to stay instead of drifting. You gave me a family and a purpose. You gave me love, Eleanor. The real kind. The kind that makes everything else make sense." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge. Eleanor thought about the girl she had been, scared and alone on the church steps. She thought about all the moments that had led her to this one, the hard conversations and the gentle kisses, the births of her children and the building of her school, the quiet evenings on the porch and the grand adventures in the desert. It had not always been easy, but it had always been worth it. "We should bring the grandchildren here someday," James said. And Eleanor realized with a start that Thomas had married the year before, and his wife was expecting their first child. They were going to be grandparents. "I would like that," Eleanor said. "We can tell them the story of how their grandparents met, how you rescued me with an offer of open skies." "You rescued yourself," James corrected gently. "I just had the good sense to follow you." Eleanor smiled and kissed him, still feeling that flutter in her stomach after all these years. "We rescued each other," she said. "That is the truth of it." As they rode home under the stars, Eleanor felt a deep contentment. Her life had not turned out anything like she expected when she was young. She had been rejected by the institution that was supposed to provide community and meaning. She had been labeled a troublemaker and an outcast, but in losing the church, she had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found authentic faith, the kind that lived in questions and wonder rather than rigid rules. She had found true love, the kind that celebrated her strength instead of trying to diminish it. She had found purpose in teaching children to think for themselves and building a life based on honesty and mutual respect. Years later, when Eleanor was in her 60s, she wrote down the story of her life for her grandchildren. She wanted them to know where they came from, to understand the courage it took to ask questions, and the rewards that came from staying true to yourself even when the world pushed back. She wrote about that pivotal day when she was banned from the church, about the handsome cowboy who offered her open skies, about falling in love under the stars and building a life from nothing. She wrote about the challenges they faced and the joys they celebrated, about their children and their school and their ranch. But most of all, she wrote about faith, the real kind. Not the kind that demanded obedience, but the kind that lived in honest seeking, in loving your neighbor, in building something good with your own two hands, in watching the stars and feeling connected to something larger than yourself, in finding a partner who walked beside you instead of ahead of or behind you. The manuscript became treasured in their family, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of your life can lead to the best outcomes if you have the courage to stay true to yourself and the wisdom to recognize love when it offers you its hand. Eleanor and James lived to see all 4 of their children married and happy, to meet 17 grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. The school Eleanor founded continued to operate long after she retired from teaching, becoming known throughout the territory for its progressive approach to education. The ranch James built prospered and was eventually divided among their children, keeping the land in the family. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration at the ranch. Friends and family came from all over the territory to honor them. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and tears, food and music and dancing. But when the celebration ended and the guests departed, Eleanor and James slipped away to their spot in the desert one more time. They were older now, their bodies slower and marked by time, but the love between them was as strong as ever. They sat on their rock under the vast expanse of stars, holding hands like they had done 1,000 times before. 50 years, Eleanor said wonderingly. Can you believe it has been 50 years? Best 50 years of my life, James said. His voice was rougher now, weathered by age, but still full of warmth. I would do it all again exactly the same way. Even the hard parts, Eleanor asked. Especially the hard parts, James said, because they made the good parts even sweeter, because they taught us who we really were, because we went through them together. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. I love you, James Coltrane. I have loved you since the day you told me we could worship under open skies, and I will love you until I take my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Eleanor Coltrane. You are the bravest, smartest, most remarkable woman in the world, and I thank God every day that you asked those questions that got you thrown out of church, because if you had not, I might never have found you. They sat together as the night deepened. 2 people who had built a life on truth and love and the freedom to be themselves. The desert stretched out around them, unchanging and patient, bearing witness to their love story one more time. When they finally rode home in the early hours of the morning, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. They put the horses away and walked hand in hand to their house, past the schoolhouse where generations of children had learned to ask questions, past the barns and pastures where their cattle grazed, past the gardens Eleanor had tended for decades. Inside, they climbed into the bed they had shared for 50 years, and James pulled Eleanor close. Thank you, he whispered into her hair, for everything, for your courage and your honesty, for your love, for our life together. Thank you, Eleanor whispered back, for seeing me, for standing beside me, for giving me open skies when I needed them most. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the way they had done for half a century, 2 souls who had found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful together. Eleanor passed away peacefully 3 years later, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, with James holding her hand. Her last words were open skies, and James understood. She was ready for the next adventure, whatever it might be. James followed her 2 years after that, his heart simply giving out one night as he slept. The family buried them side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the desert and the mountains beyond. On their shared headstone, their children inscribed the words that had defined their love story. We worshipped under open skies. The story of Eleanor and James became legend in Arizona territory and later in the state of Arizona. It was a story about courage and faith, about love and partnership, about the power of asking questions and staying true to yourself. It was a story about 2 people who refused to let the world tell them who they should be and instead created their own path, their own faith, their own beautiful life. And on clear nights, Locals swore they could sometimes see two figures sitting on a certain flat rock in the desert, hand in hand under the stars, still worshiping under open skies, still loving each other across the boundaries of life and death, a testament to the enduring power of true love and the freedom that comes from being brave enough to ask questions, even when the answers cost you everything you thought you knew.